In the last lesson, we covered the basics of creating, reading, updating, and deleting, which are our CRUD operations within Adonis using both Lucid models and the database module. In this lesson, we're going to dig in a little bit deeper to creating data by learning how to do so through our defined relationships. So to start out, let's quickly summarize the three different methods that we covered in the last lesson to actually create data within our database. So we have this first method here where we are actually creating a new instance of our project model, setting the properties that we need to store within our database record on that new model instance, and then finally calling await project.save to actually save that new model instance off into the database. The second approach here is actually calling directly off of our model itself the method create and passing in all of the data that we need for that new database record. The third method is using the database module to insert into the table projects the data that we want to actually insert for that new record. And actually, since recording that last lesson, I actually learned that we can simplify this a little bit by just getting rid of this insert query and having database.table, and it will do the exact same thing as well. So now, in addition to these three methods, we can actually conditionally determine whether we should insert a new record using a method on our model called first or create. So let's go ahead and comment this out, and let's do const project equals await project dot first or create. And so this method actually accepts two different arguments. The first is a search payload. This is essentially an object-based where statement. The second is a create payload. This is the data that would actually be used to create the record within the database. So what this method will try to do is use the search payload to search for records within our database matching the criteria that we set. If it can find one or more records within our database matching this criteria, it will return back the first match that it finds back into our project variable, and it will skip the save payload altogether. If, however, it cannot find any records within our database matching the search criteria, it will then execute our save payload and save that save payload off into the database as a new project, and then it will return that new project back to us. So for example here, we could search our project table for a project with the name my example project. Next, let's go ahead and define that we want to, if my example project cannot be found, we want to create that project, my example project. And then we can also give it whatever additional information we might need for this particular project. So we'll just put test description there, and my keyboard flubbed up a little bit, test description there. Okay, so now if first or create can find a record in our database with the name my example project, it will just return that record back to us. If it cannot, it will execute this save payload and save this data off as a new project record, and then return that new project record to us. Now, a slight alternative to this first or create method is update or create, and it's going to accept pretty much the exact same thing. So if we go ahead and copy this and paste it down below the line, comment out first or create, and change this to update or create, you'll see that there's no red squigglies, meaning that this is actually perfectly valid just the way that it is. So the arguments here are the exact same as first or create. We have our search payload, and then we have, instead of this just being a create payload, this is now an update or create payload. So it will attempt to find a record with my example project as the name. If it does find it, then it will execute this as an update payload, updating the record with any details that we provide here. Since the name of our update payload is the same as what we're creating, this name would not change. However, we would get the description added onto this record if it did not have one. If, however, a record is not found with the name my example project, this will be executed as a create payload, and that newly created record will then be returned back to us. Okay, so before we move on here, let's actually go ahead and just clean up our store statement here a little bit. Let's get it down to where we're just using the project.create method, since this is a simple one-liner to create our project. And now we're ready to go ahead and move on to talking about creating data using relationships. And now before we actually start talking about relationships, I have a quick correction to make. So within our project, within our tasks, and within our user, we defined our many-to-many relationships without a pivot table. This was under the idea that Adonis concatenated the two model names together in snake case form in a plural fashion. So it would be project users, project tasks. That was my previous understanding. However, I've since found out that is incorrect, and indeed the default for this for Adonis is to have these singular. So by default, it would be searching for project user and project task. Those would be the tables that it would look for by default for the pivot table. Now, since that's not the case, we need to manually define these pivot tables for our relationships. So within our project, we need to manually define for our many-to-many users that the pivot table is project users. For our tasks, we need to manually define that the pivot table is project tasks. And then we could do the same for our task and for our user. Alternatively, we could dive into our migrations and alter the table name itself. So if we were to do that, let's head into our terminal and run node ace migration rollback. And now that that's rolled back, we can change these table names. So we can take the S off so that they are both singular for our project user and project tasks. And then we can go ahead and run node ace migration run to recreate all of those tables in proper fashion. And now we don't need to have this pivot table manually defined on these records. And we should be good to move forward. So now we can actually use these relationship definitions to persist data within our database. And thanks to these relationship definitions, we don't need to define a model for our two intermediary tables, project task and project user. Instead, we can use three different powerful methods that Lucid will provide to us. And in order to properly showcase this off, we're going to need a couple of test users to work with. So within our users controller here, let's go ahead and manually define a couple of test users and save those off to the database. So here I have user1 with a username of testuser1, an email of testuser1@test.com, and then just any password will do. And then for test user 2, we have test user 2, testuser2@test.com, and then again, any password will do. We're calling user.createMany since we have two different users that we need to create, passing in an array with user 1 and user 2. Those will both be created within our database whenever we call our userController.store method, and then it will return back those users to us as JSON. So let's go ahead and register a route for this as well. So let's do route.get test user, and then users controller.store. And since we're just doing a GET request here, we can either jump into a browser and just visit this page, or we can use a REST client and just send off a GET request for this particular URL. So we could do test user, send that off, and we got back our two newly created test users. So now we're good to move on to talking about relationships. So let's jump into our projects controller here, and within our store method, we're good to move forward. So step one of working with a relationship using Lucid models is first having an instance of a record. Whether we query for that record or use a newly created record, it doesn't matter. So here within our store, we have a newly created record and our instance is stored in the variable project. So what we can do is actually reference a method off of this project instance called related. And then within related here, we can actually define the relationship that we want to grab. So in this case, we'll be using our users. And now what's returned back from this related method actually varies based off of the relationship type. So whether it's one-to-many or many-to-many. So first off here, we're going to start off with learning how to attach a many-to-many record. So in essence, attaching a new record within our intermediary table for our project users relationship. So first and foremost here, whenever we do this, this is going to be async, so we need to await. And then next, in order to attach a new record through this relationship, we actually can call a method called attach. And now attach accepts two different argument types. It can either accept an array of IDs or an object where the IDs are the keys. So before we dive into that, let's actually grab the two test users that we created just a moment ago. So let's do const user1 equals await user.find or fail. And I believe they had an ID of 1 and 2. So we should just be able to reference them by their direct ID here since we're just testing this out. User.find or fail for 2. Okay. And then within attach here, we can provide just an array of the IDs. So we could do user1.id, user2.id. And what attach will do here is first, it will grab this project's ID. And then whenever we call related here, it's going to grab the relationship definition off of our project model for the relationship that we provide here, which in this case is users. So if we take a look at our project model here, we actually have this users definition here. So it's going to take a look at how we define this relationship. And then lastly, whenever we call attach, it's going to take each of the IDs that we provide or each of the attachments that we provide, and it's going to create a new relationship record for each of these. So for example, if we had project 1, it would create a new record for project 1 user 1, and then it would create another for project 1 user 2. Now you might be asking, this is great, but what if I have additional data on my intermediary table I need to save? And that's a great question. We actually have this exact scenario right here. So our project user table actually has an additional column on it called role ID. So what if we actually wanted to provide the role ID here instead of relying on the database default? So we can use the second attach argument type, which is just an object here. and then we can provide the IDs for our users as the object's keys. So this would be user1.id, and then we provide a sub-object for this with the additional intermediary table columns that we need to provide. So we would do role ID, and then whatever we want that role ID to be for this particular user. And then again, we could attach user2 the exact same way, user2.id, and then give it whatever role ID we want them to have. So we can actually save this file, jump back into Insomnia here, the REST client that I'm using, change this to a post request, change the URL to projects, and then let's change it to where we just have a name, and let's call this just project 1. And let's send this off. And oops, I left the comma on it. All right, let's send it off again. And there we go. So now we have our newly created project. And if we take a look within a database GUI here, I'm using Tables Plus, and we jump into our projects, you'll see we have that new project here. And then if we jump into our project users, we actually have 2 records here as we defined within our store method here, where the project ID is 1, the user ID is 1, the role ID is 1, and then for our second record, the project ID is 1, user ID is 2, and role ID is 2, exactly as we defined it here within this attach method. So now that we've got users added, what if we want to remove one or more users from our project? For this, we can make use of the detach method. This is essentially going to do the inverse of attach. It's going to remove the intermediary record for the provided IDs. So if we scroll down from store to our update method here, and we clean this up a little bit, so let's go ahead and get rid of this database module insert here, and let's uncomment our project update. So the way that we could detach all existing users from this particular project is by doing await project. Again, we need to call related, define that we want to do this for the users relationship, and then call detach. Now by default, if we provide no arguments to the detach method, it's going to remove all for the particular record. So in this case, it will remove all users from this project. Now, if that's not what we want, and we just want to remove particular users from this project, we can provide an array of those IDs. So here, if we scroll up a little bit, copy our user, let's grab user 2 here, scroll back down to our update, paste that in, and let's just delete out user 2. So user2.id. Let's go ahead and give that a save. Let's jump back into Insomnia here, change this from a post to a put, and then projects / whatever project we just created. In this case, my ID is 1, pass that ID in an URL, so it's project /1, send that off. If we jump back into our GUI here and refresh our project user table, you'll see that we no longer have a user 2 here, we just have a user 1. So in this case, detach has gotten rid of our user 2 and left user 1 intact. And I want to make it explicitly clear, this only applies for this particular project. So since we are providing the ID of 1, it's only going to apply to all projects where the ID is 1. So we've covered adding and removing many-to-many records, but what if we want to detach all records, then reattach only the defined records on our request? For this, we can make use of a method called sync. Sync will detach all records, then it will reattach only the records that we provide. And sync is going to accept the exact same arguments here as attach. So let's scroll up to our store statement here and actually grab attach. So let's just copy this out and scroll back down to update and replace our detach. And then let's change attach here to sync. And so again, here we could either provide an array of IDs, or as we are here, an object where the keys are the IDs that we want to store. So in this particular case, since we got rid of user 2 for our project 1, let's go ahead and resync user 2 onto this project. So let's get rid of user 1 here and save this out, go back into Insomnia here and redo this put request for this project 1. Okay, that completed successfully. Let's jump into Tables Plus. And now what we should see is that all project users for our project 1 have been detached and only user 2 has been reattached for project 1. So we should anticipate an ID of 2, project 1, user ID of 2, and a role ID of 2. So let's go ahead and refresh, and you'll see we get exactly that, except for I forgot to account that we did delete user 2, so our ID is actually 3. Okay, so now to round out our many-to-many talks, let's cover how to create a whole new record while also creating the intermediary table record all in one blow. To do this, we can make use of one of the create methods that we actually covered earlier. In this particular case, we're going to use create. However, we could also call create many, first or create, or update and create. So let's say that whenever we create a new project, so let's scroll up to our store method here. In addition to attaching in our created user, we also want to create an introductory task for this user as well. So let's get rid of our 2 users here since we only want to attach one user, which is the creating user. So whatever user creates this project, we want to attach them onto this project. So we can also get rid of our user to grab here. And then below our user attach here, let's do await project related. And instead of doing users, let's do tasks. And now this particular relationship is also many-to-many, so we could call sync, we could call attach, we could call detach. However, in this particular case, we don't have any tasks to do this with. In order to call one of these 3 methods, we need to have tasks on our table to actually use, since we need IDs to perform these actions. So since we want to create an introductory task anytime that we create a new project, create here makes the most sense. So let's call create. And then just like we're creating this directly off of the task itself, all that we need to do here is provide the data in an object form that we want to persist into the database record. So let's see, I think for project, all that we need is a name and a creator. So we should be able to do name, welcome to your new project. And then we need a creator. So created by user1.id. So now we should be able to give this a save. Let's jump back into Insomnia. Let's change this put to a post and get rid of the 1. And let's change this to project 2. So we'll create a brand new project and send this off. Okay, that completed successfully. Let's jump back into Tables Plus here. Let's take a look at our tasks table, and you'll see we now have a brand new task where the name is welcome to your new project, the status ID defaulted to 1, and the created by is 1 for our user 1. Now we can also jump into our project task, and we'll see that we also got an intermediary column created for this relationship as well. The ID is 1, the sort order is 0, project ID 2, and task is 1. Okay, so far we've been discussing many-to-many records, but what about many-to-one records? In our previous example here, we actually created a many-to-one record without really even thinking about it. So whenever we call create here and we provided a created by ID, this is actually creating our many-to-one record. Our users can have many tasks, but our task can only have one creator. So in order to provide a many-to-one, all that we need to really do is provide a value for the actual ID column itself. So in this case, our created by is our relationship column, defining the creator of the task, and then we're providing that the actual creator ID of user1 ID. So if we were to actually do this for the task itself, if we would jump over to our task controller, and then within our store here, we could do const task equals await task dot create, give it a name, example task, give it a creator, so created by, we'll just do 1, and then we could additionally do assign to also define that many-to-one relationship as well. So we could provide that a user ID of 2. And then we could also continue on for the remainder of the data that we have defined on our task. So that would be like description, due at, status ID, and so on. But in essence, that is how we would go about creating a many-to-one relationship, or even a one-to-one relationship as well. So now that we've taken a look at some of the power our relationship definitions and our models actually provide us, we'll be continuing onward by taking a more in-depth look into reading and querying data from our database in the next lesson.